Over the last couple of months, I've noticed an interesting trend in the metagame of the GOAT format tournament scene, and I wanted to take a moment to compile some data about this in order to formulate some educated guesses about the potential causes and effects of this trend, and then make this video to hopefully stimulate a discussion about the metagame. Welcome back to GOAT Duels. I'm InfusionsCap, and today I want to try and answer the question, what's going on with Burn? At the World Championship in October 2021, Delinquent really put Panda Burn on the map when he won the tournament with it, even though the deck was not really on anyone's radar at the time. It's not like Burn had never been done before, but this was a new variation on it, and the deck was frighteningly consistent. Initially, I thought that Surprise Factor had a lot to do with this as well, and while I do still think it was a factor at the time, I don't think it was the most important factor because Panda Burn continued to do well in other tournaments in early and mid-2022. Since the World Championships of 2022, however, I've noticed that the representation of Panda Burn decks in the top cuts keeps going down. In an attempt to understand why this is happening and what broader implications it has on the metagame, I compiled some data on specific cards. These are the 5 cards I wanted to analyze in the greatest detail, because of the commonly cited cards against Burn decks, they tend to be the most effective in a vacuum. Just to quickly clarify, I'm not including something as obviously strong and polarizing as Genzo in this analysis, nor am I including things like Hysteric Fairy, Amazoness Archer, the Little Swordsman of Ale, or Token Thanksgiving, because while those are effective cards in the matchup for what they do, they really only do one specific thing, and which of those cards you would choose would vary from deck to deck, and I want this to be more of a general analysis. I'll do my best to not make this feel like a statistics class, but I do think it's important we have these numbers before we can truly discuss. Without further ado, on to the data. Let's start with the most recent World Championship that took place on October 22nd and 23rd of 2022, and we'll work forward from there. Here's the winning deck list for the event. A couple of things to note with this event. This analysis is looking at 16 decks for this event, where the other 3 events we will look at will only have 8 decks analyzed for each. Additionally, this event had time controls for each round, so the side decking strategy is a bit different when the rounds are timed. I'm not going to go into too much detail about that in this video, just know that it does lead to some variations, so it's worth keeping that in mind. Only one Panda Burn player made the top cut for this event. The 5 cards we are looking at specifically are unlimited, so the maximum number of copies of each of them that we could have seen in the top 16 cut would have been 48. There were 8 copies of Royal Decree in main decks, 9 copies of Dust Tornado in main decks, with 6 in the side decks for a total of 15 in the top cut. 12 copies of Mobius the Frost Monarch were sided with none in the main decks, 24 copies of Mystik Wok were side decked with none in the main decks, and 6 copies of Dust Wombat were side decked with none in the main decks. The most common trend in the side decks for this event was a single copy of Mobius the Frost Monarch and 2 copies of Mystik Wok. 10 of the top 16 decks used that exact distribution. Moving on now to November 19th and Premium World Championship Qualifier 26. From here on out, we will be looking at 8 decks at a time instead of 16. This was the first event of the new season after the 2022 World Championships, and the meta was pretty interesting for this one. Standard Chaos was half of the field, and the other half was 4 different decks, one of which was this Panda Burn list. This time around, there were 5 total copies of Royal Decree in top 8, 3 main decked and 2 side decked. There were 5 total copies of Dust Tornado, 3 main decked and 2 side decked. 4 copies of Mobius were sided, 12 copies of Mystik Wok were sided, and 2 copies of Dust Wombat were sided. Worth noting from this event, only one deck list in the top 8 did not have any Mystik Woks in the side deck, and of the 7 that did, 5 of them had 2 copies. This, coupled with the trend from the World Championship where single Mobius double Wok was the most common, is crucial information, because we can see a pattern developing from this. On now to November 27th and Premium World Championship Qualifier 27. This is where things start to get really interesting. One thing to note right off the bat is that not a single Panda Burn deck made it into the top 8 for this event. Royal Decree took a dip in popularity, going from 5 total copies to only 2. Mystik Wok had equal popularity at 12 total copies. Wombat took a small hit in popularity, going from 2 copies to 1, while Mobius got a small boost, going from 4 copies to 5. The big winner was Dust Tornado, going from 5 copies all the way up to 12. The representation of decks in the top cut were more streamlined for this event as well. Only 3 Standard Chaos made it in, alongside 3 Warriors, with 2 outliers, an Earth Aggro and a Bazoo Dimension Fusion. Warriors tend to line up well into Standard Chaos, so after the previous event having so many Standard Chaos decks, it makes sense that we would see this trend. More on that later. Moving on to December 4th and Premium World Championship Qualifier 28. The meta opened back up a little bit for this one, with a couple of control decks and a Reasoning Gate deck joining the party. In spite of a wider spread of decks, Panda Burn is still not among them. Decree got a small bump in popularity, going back to a full playset in the main deck. Worth noting, the deck that did this is the deck that won the event. Mobius and Wombat retained their same level of popularity from the previous event, at 5 copies and 1 copy respectively. Worth noting, the only deck to utilize Wombat was the Reasoning Gate deck. Dust Tornado and Mystik Wok even took small hits in popularity, going down from 8 total and 11 total respectively, but the representation was still quite high for those two cards. So now that we have our sample size, we can see from the time of the World Championship in October, Dust Wombat has steadily dropped in popularity. Mobius dropped right after the World Championship and has now settled around 5 copies on average per top 8. Royal Decree almost bottomed out as low as Wombat, but is actually slightly trending back up. Dust Tornado dropped right after the World Championship, spiked back up to an absurd number of copies per top 8, and is now settling anywhere between 8 to 12 copies per top 8 depending on the given day. Wok seems to be the most standout card against the Burn matchup, however, hovering consistently between 11 and 13 copies per top 8 since the conclusion of the World Championship. Here we can see that only 9 different archetypes have made the top cut since the World Championship. While Goat Control and Chaos Control haven't been extremely popular since the conclusion of the World Championship, they are tied for the third most popular choice amongst the sample size of the 4 events. Warrior decks are in second place in terms of popularity, which makes sense because, like I said earlier, they tend to do well against the standard Chaos decks, which still remain the most represented in top cuts going into the 2023 season. While decks like Chaos Control and Goat Control tend to do well against Warriors, they are somewhat countered by standard Chaos. So, we have once again achieved the Triangle meta. So where do we go from here, and what does the future look like for Panda Burn? Since this is still a card game and the nature of the format does allow for some variance, I don't think Burn is going to disappear for good, and even if it did, it would be destined to return. Think about it. If it ever became so unpopular that people stopped siding for it, it would become popular again as soon as someone wins with it, because we would be back to exactly where we were when Delinquent first won with it at the World Championship in 2021. Burn wasn't completely ignored then, but it certainly hadn't achieved a level of popularity where things like Mystik Wok were nearly as common as they are now. All that being said, I do think the immediate future looks pretty bleak for Burn, at least in terms of the tournament setting, simply because both Chaos Control and Goat Control can access Decree with little to no sacrifice, and the power level Decree can have against trap-heavy Warrior decks is really the main course, but it being a hard counter to Burn is just icing on the cake. It's almost like collateral damage. Warrior decks probably struggle the most against Burn out of the big 3, but thanks to things like Dust Tornado and Mobius, they certainly aren't without any counterplay. Many of the same points can be made about the standard Chaos decks when it comes to the side, plus they tend to play other things in the main deck that can help them against Burn as well, be it Magician of Faith to recycle things like Heavy Storm, or just the natural advantage of having things like Raigeki Break. I think the Burn decks are down for the count, but not out for good. Chain Energy seems to be looking like the next evolution of that deck, but will it be enough? I want to hear what you guys think. Am I selling this archetype short, or has the sun finally set on Burn decks? Where do you think the meta is going to go as we approach GFC 19 on January 28th? Let me know what you think in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to like and subscribe. That's it for this one, and until next time, duel well and duel often.